So let's start. My name is Jasinevicius, and I'm here today with my colleague Giuntoli, and we are from the Joint Research Center Bioeconomy Unit. We will present briefly the European level wood flows and then some assessment of pathways in respect to biodiversity and climate change mitigation. But first of all, I don't see the slides moving. Oh, sorry, it was too quick.
Working?
It's working now. Now it's moving too fast. Wait a second. I need to reload the sharing.
Just to mention that in the morning we had a mention of the JRC reports on biomass during our policy panel, so it seems that they are already forming opinions in Brussels, and as they should be. So we're really grateful also that you are going to be sharing some of your results.
Yes, here we are. So briefly, a few words about the GRC. It's one of the European Commission's directorate, and it's spread all over the Europe within the 6 sites. We almost 3,000 employees, mostly the scientific stuff. And the important is to note that we have no policy agenda, so we are not a policy directorate. What we do is the policy support, and one of the fields we are working, it's the forestry biomass. And what we do since 2009, we do wood resource balance. It's a tool to represent the sources and uses of woody biomass within the European scale. What you see here is just a summary table of each member state, but what we do, we compile the data from every member state on the sources side and the user side. The data we use, you also see in the table on the right low corner, and we are very much dependent on the officially reported data. You might ask why we are having a data only until 2017. It's just because some of the questionnaires, like joint wood energy questionnaire, is lagging like 2 years and published every 2 years. So what we have is a time series of 2009-2017. So in the wood resource balance table, you see the sources. So the primary wood, what is coming mainly from the forest, including net imports, the secondary sources, so all residues produced by the industry and their net imports, and then tertiary sources is like post-consumer wood that it's coming back into the wood flows. And on the uses side, you see the main industries that are representing wood use in the European level, and also the energy sector. What it's out of this table, you see it's what we found in this analysis, that there is a significant unreported sources, meaning that uses are larger, like by 10-15% compared to the sources. This might be due to the data inconsistencies in reporting, or simply larger uses. So if we look at the time series, so the unreported sources varies from 6 to 13% depending on the year, on the data reliability, and so on. So what we see, the important gap between sources and uses at the European level. Of course, it differs from member states to member states, and we have published analysis for each member state. As a result, we also presenting the other tool is a Sankey diagram. It's mainly the same data as in the wood resource balance, but it's just better illustrated. We see the circularity and the flows better than in the table of the wood resource balance. So the important trends, what the trends we observed in the past years since 2009, we see that sources is continuously increasing, meaning that harvesting is increasing. And mainly sources are increasing from primary wood, meaning the fresh round wood. And the uses obviously is also increasing because sources are increasing. But what we observe that the uses for energy is increasing more rapidly than the uses for material, meaning for the products. The main factors that affecting the woody biomass availability in the EU, it's forest growth, of course, management and fellings and natural disturbances. Definitely, this is not a full list. There are much more factors that are affecting the wood availability in EU. I can mention like climate change. I can mention the cascade use of wood, but the factors that we have data to show, and it's quite important, forest management, fellings, and natural disturbances. So forest growth, as we see in this chart, is slightly decreasing over the past years, the green line. But at the same time, we have increasing fellings. Here are many lines of fellings. It's not very important. It's due to the different methodologies of accounting and data sources of accounting fellings. But we see the trend that fellings are increasing in the last years, and the forest growth is slightly decreasing. And what we have, it's that the gap between the growth and fellings is narrowing down, meaning that in the future, the potential of wood availability is decreasing. The other factor that affecting the wood availability is natural disturbances. Lately, we collect the data from the 17 member states at the EU. Unfortunately, we cannot cover all the member states because this data is not registered in remaining member states. But what we see that natural disturbances followed by the salvage loggings are increasing. And in the past, it's almost doubled in 2018 due to the outbreak in the Central Europe. This illustrates that the huge amount of wood due to the natural disturbances are flowing into the system and increasing the wood availability, but it's just for short time. And we don't have a crystal ball to predict how the future will look like and how it will affect the wood supply and the wood resource balance. So the key messages from my part, very briefly, is that wood biomass sources and uses are increasing in the EU in the past years. And woody biomass availability is driven by various factors, like, of course, the growth, management, fellings, and natural disturbances. Increasing harvests and decreasing growth most probably will negatively affect the wood availability in the future. And the gap between the woody biomass uses and sources remains significant. This is mainly due to the reported data inconsistencies. And now I'll give the floor to my colleague Jacobo to continue about possible pathways.
Yes, thank you, Gediminas. Can you hear me properly? I hope so.
Yes, we can hear you properly.
Oh, okay, great. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Giuntoli. I'm following up on Gediminas because in our report we had two parts. So we had a more quantitative part that Gedas explained, and then we had a more qualitative part because we wanted to look at the potential impacts of certain bioenergy pathways on climate and on biodiversity. And I saw this morning already our results were introduced. So, and actually they are not new because we published them last January, but maybe I thought we could introduce some context on why we produced these results and how, and what do they mean in our opinion, or in my opinion, actually. So the framing was that forests in Europe and around the world, they are under stress. I mean, our colleagues published a report recently, last year, on a summary of ecosystem status across Europe. And while there are some positive trends in forest condition, many are still negative. So next slide, please. So the problem that we wanted to tackle is that we know that forest ecosystems and around the world actually are in poor condition. We also know that bioenergy places additional demand of wood and of wood on forest ecosystems because actually that's the role of the Renewable Energy Directives to increase demand for bioenergy, for certain type of bioenergy. So this will cause likely changes in forest management practices, and these changes in forest practices might have significant impacts, additional impacts on the forest. And one of the main aspects is that carbon impacts have been of forest bioenergy are kind of known. We have debated this for about 10 years. The JRC collaborated with other services to produce the impact assessment of the Renewable Energy Directive in 2016, then the now Directive 2018-2001. So all of that information is still there and it's still valid. But what we have seen also in the literature, in the bioenergy literature, is that there is a large focus on carbon and climate and very little on biodiversity and ecosystems health. So there is the risk of promoting solutions that might mitigate climate change at the expense of ecosystems, what we call bioperversities. Next slide, please. So we wanted to identify whether we could identify some of these bioperversities and define a way to avoid them. So the method that we chose, since there is no clear quantitative method for impact assessment on biodiversity and ecosystems condition, these methods are coming, especially in the life cycle assessment community. We decided to use simply a literature review and then to synthesize this knowledge through a qualitative approach. And we decided to focus on 3 interventions and several outcomes for each of them. So we focused on the removal of logging residues, afforestation, and conversion of natural forests to plantation. And I'm not going to go into details. Probably most of you have read the report, but we can discuss this later. Next slide, please. So one of the main questions that we get, or that we got at the time we still get, is why did we choose these interventions? Well, the point is that the forest system is actually very integrated and very connected, as you can see through this figure. There are many material flows across the system, but there are also market-mediated flows, especially when we talk about material end uses. You can have substitution of concrete or other materials. And you have, of course, in the energy sector, you have market-mediated effects where you change energy sources. And then you have different scales. So you can have imported biomass for energy, for instance, like wood pellets. So no matter where you intervene in the system, the dynamics of systems are quite unpredictable. Actually, they are unpredictable. The future is unknown. So what we decided to do was to take a snapshot of potential dynamics responses of the system. Next slide, please, Gedas. And we had made a study in the past on what these dynamics might be. Actually, we studied what was already assessed in many studies on bioenergy sustainability. And we saw that there are 3 possible macro categories of responses. One is in changes. So if you increase the demand of biomass, you might have changes in forest management to increase the supply. You might have changes, diversion of flows of materials from the industry, for instance, to energy, or you can have changes of land use, like afforestation, for instance. So we defined our epistemic box, and we thought, okay, we need to find pathways that are change-oriented, so pathways that might happen if we increase the demand of bioenergy, pathways that provide additional biomass, so biomass that would not have been produced if there was no bioenergy demand. We also chose these pathways because they're kind of aspirational. So they are presented a lot in the literature as positive outcomes of a bioenergy policy. We might have forests that so produce more wood, or we might convert native forests into plantations that are more productive. So we might mitigate climate change through that. Also, we know that more traditional management is already studied, both in terms of carbon, as I said before, we published something in 2013 on carbon impacts of forest bioenergy. And then on terms of biodiversity, there is a whole literature on forest management and impacts on ecosystems. But for sure, this is not a complete list of potential pathways. Next slide, please, Gedas. So if we look at the definitions, then we took these three interventions, we defined several different factors that could be applied. And so we defined what we call pathways archetype. We ended up with, 24 pathways that then we could follow up through the literature and classify their impacts on carbon and on biodiversity. Next slide, Gedas, please. So what we did for biodiversity and ecosystem condition, we defined 4 broad categories of risk, some high risk, so pathways that, or interventions, I should say, and pathways that have negative effect on biodiversity and ecosystem conditions, neutral to positive, medium high risk, and medium low risk. Next slide, please, Gedas. Then when it comes to carbon, again, we know that the carbon impact of forest bioenergy is time dependent a lot. So we used the metric of payback time, which is not very refined, and there are many criticisms to it, but it simplifies our assessment, in our synthesis of knowledge. So we defined 4 broad categories also here in terms of payback time. Next slide, please, Gedas. And what we could do in this way was to characterize where the pathways would fall in win-win conditions, win-win solutions, lose-lose, or by perversities. Next slides, please. And next one even. This is our results, but I just want to point out a few of them. You can click it on, get us, thanks. Okay, so we could identify some win-win, and I think you heard already this morning, slash and some afforestation. We have some bioperversities that we need to be careful about, like afforestation of agricultural land with monoculture plantations. And then we have clearly some lose-lose pathways, like coarse woody debris, conversion of primary forest to plantations. And we have stumps that are actually in between. Next slide, please, Geda. So I come to my conclusions. What did we get out of this study? Well, the first point is that sustainability assessments of bioenergy have often ignored the impacts on biodiversity. And this is my personal opinion. We wrote a paper, there is a reference there at the bottom. Integrated assessment models are often inadequate to capture land management impacts and even other impacts of bioenergy, which might drive to misleading conclusions actually on bioenergy. We found actually that most, but not all lose-lose options that are assessed in this study are excluded from the EU Green Deal documents. And one that is not excluded are plantations that are established from recently converted native forests. I can expand on that later if you want. As I said, the list of pathways is in no way comprehensive, and additional research is really needed to identify further win-win. But what I wanted to take-home message from me is that bioenergy sustainability governance is actually a wicked problem. So it affects multiple spatial scales because you can have biodiversity impacts that are very site-specific and a better managed smaller spatial scale, but at the same time you have global trade, which has significant impacts on third countries and all over the world. Then you have multiple interlinked industries within the forest system, as I showed before. So you have market-mediated impacts, and basically you are in an indeterminate situation. You cannot know the future. You cannot predict what will happen if. And you have multiple valid perspectives and multiple framings. So there are no right or wrong solutions, actually. Our task was to look at the more environmental aspects of this issue. So we took a more environmental perspective, as I think most of you probably in the audience, but there are many other perspectives. Energy security is coming up now clearly, economics, rural development, etc. And my message is that science won't solve the debate, but it can help with the problem boundaries. Like we did in this exercise, we took a via negative approach. We defined what are the lose-lose solutions. This should be excluded, but what is better to do or good to do, it's something that needs to be discussed in a broader community. Thank you. That's the end of my.
Thank you very much for those presentations.